Mr. Whitmore. If you're here to inspect your future property, you're a week early. I still have legal possession until the 31st.
She saved a stranger's life in a Christmas snowstorm. She never expected him to return as the billionaire buying her family. Farm. The truck came up the frozen driveway at exactly 4:47 in the afternoon on December 23rd. Tatiana Clark heard it before she saw it. The crunch of tires against ice-packed gravel cut through the silence of her family's dying farm like a blade through old rope. She set down the feed bucket she'd been carrying, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter Wisconsin air, and reached for the pitchfork leaning against the barn door. She saved a stranger's life in a blizzard 3 years ago. She never expected him to come back as the billionaire buying her family's farm. Before we go any further, I need to pause and say something important. Thank you. Because of you, Mr. Steele Rich Stories just passed 3,500 subscribers, and that milestone means the world to this channel. If you know someone who needs hope right now, someone who believes in second chances even when life keeps dealing bad hands, share this video with them. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me about a time someone unexpectedly changed your life, and if you haven't subscribed yet, join this family. Now, back to Tatiana and the man stepping out of that truck. Have you ever felt like life was fundamentally unfair? Like you did everything right, worked until your bones ached, sacrificed your dreams, your relationships, your youth, and still watched someone with deeper pockets and better luck hold all the power over your future? That feeling lived in Tatiana Clark's chest every single day for the past 18 months. 4 generations of Clarks had worked this land. Her great-great-grandfather had cleared these fields with his bare hands in 1923. Her grandfather had survived the Depression by selling eggs door to door in town. Her father had modernized the dairy operation in the 1980s and made it profitable for 2 decades. And now Tatiana, at 34 years old, was about to become the Clark who lost it all. The bank had given her until December 30th first. 8 days. 8 days to come up with $523,000 in outstanding loans, or Whitmore Technologies' agricultural subsidiary would take possession of the property after purchasing her debt 6 months earlier. She knew exactly who owned Whitmore Technologies. The whole country knew. His face had been on the cover of Forbes 3 times. His net worth fluctuated somewhere between $4 and $6 billion depending on stock prices. His name was Caleb Whitmore, and 3 years ago, on a night exactly like this one, Tatiana had dragged his half-frozen body through a Christmas Eve blizzard and saved his life. She gripped the pitchfork tighter as the truck door opened. She'd been expecting Martin Doyle. The bank's representative had called twice this week, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he reminded her of the timeline and the unfortunate circumstances and the opportunities for a graceful transition. She'd hung up on him both times. Or maybe she'd been expecting another one of those opportunistic buyers who'd been circling her property like vultures for months, offering her 40 cents on the dollar for land worth triple what she owed, knowing she had no leverage and less time. What she got instead was a ghost. Caleb Whitmore stepped out of the black truck wearing a wool coat that probably cost more than her monthly feed budget. His dark hair was shorter than she remembered, threaded now with silver at the temples that hadn't been there before. He looked older, not aged by time so much as by weight, the kind of weight that settles into a man's shoulders when he's carrying something heavier than luggage. She recognized him instantly, even though she'd tried very hard over the past 3 years to forget his face. The night they met, he'd been wearing a suit soaked through with snow and blood. His rental car had slid off Highway 12 during the worst blizzard to hit Crawford County in 40 years. By the time Tatiana found him, stumbling through the whiteout toward what he thought was a farmhouse light, he'd been hypothermic and delirious. She'd half-carried, half-dragged him 2 miles through waist-deep drifts to her barn, stripped him out of his frozen clothes while he mumbled incoherently about a meeting and a merger and someone named Rachel, and kept him alive until the storm broke on Christmas morning. He'd told her his name was Cal, just Cal, a businessman from Chicago who'd taken a wrong turn. She'd believed him because she had no reason not to, and because he'd seemed so ordinary in his vulnerability. So human. She'd learned the truth 6 weeks later, when his face appeared on the evening news. Tech billionaire Caleb Whitmore acquires Midwest Agricultural Holdings, the acquisition that would eventually put her farm in his company's portfolio, the deal he'd been driving to finalize the night his car went off the road. He'd sent her a check for $10,000 2 weeks after that broadcast. A thank you note printed on cream-colored stationery with the Whitmore Technologies letterhead. She'd torn up the check and burned the note in her wood stove. Now here he stood, 18 months into her financial nightmare, 6 months after his company had purchased her debt from First Wisconsin Bank, 8 days before she lost everything her family had built. He stood in her driveway like he had any right to be here. Tatiana. His voice was the same, low and measured, with that slight Chicago accent he'd tried to hide when he'd been pretending to be ordinary. I know you don't want to see me, Mr. Whitmore. She kept her voice flat, professional, the same tone she used with the bank representatives and the lawyers and everyone else who treated her like a problem to be solved, rather than a person fighting for survival. If you're here to inspect your future property, you're a week early. I still have legal possession till the 31st. He flinched. Actually flinched, like her words had struck something soft. Good. I'm not here for that, he said. I'm here because I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you 3 years ago, and something that happened 6 months ago that you deserve to know. I don't want to hear it. Tatiana, please. You bought my debt. Your company, Whitmore Agricultural Holdings, a subsidiary of Whitmore Technologies, purchased my family's debt and called in the full amount with 6 months' notice. That's not an accident. That's not a coincidence. That's a billionaire using his resources to take what he wants. That's what I'm trying to explain. No. She raised the pitchfork slightly. Not threatening, not quite, but enough to make him stop mid-sentence. You don't get to show up here on December 23rd, the exact anniversary of the night I saved your life, and act like you're the one who deserves to be heard. I spent 2 years trying to refinance. I sold my truck. I sold my grandmother's jewelry. I took a second job cleaning offices in town at 4 in the morning so I could still work the farm during the day. And then your company came in and bought my debt from the bank I'd been negotiating with for months. Her voice cracked. She hated that it cracked. She'd trained herself not to show weakness in front of the suits and the lawyers and everyone who saw her as just another failing farmer statistic. But something about seeing him here, after everything, broke through the walls she'd built. Caleb took a step toward her, then stopped. His eyes, she noticed, looked haunted, not arrogant, not triumphant, haunted. I didn't know, he said quietly, about your farm, about the debt acquisition. I didn't know until 3 weeks ago. You expect me to believe that? It's your company. I know how it sounds. But there's more happening here than you realize, more than I realized until recently. He looked back at the truck, then at the farmhouse, then at the barn where she'd kept him alive 3 Christmases ago. I came here because I owe you my life, Tatiana, and because someone in my own organization has been working against both of us. Someone I trusted. The wind picked up, carrying snow dust across the frozen yard. Tatiana felt the cold seeping through her jacket, but she didn't move, didn't lower the pitchfork. Why had he come back? Why today, of all days? Why was the man whose company was taking her land standing in her driveway looking like he was the one who'd lost something precious? What did he mean by someone working against both of us? And why, after 3 years of silence and 6 months of watching her life crumble, did Caleb Whitmore finally have something to say? The December wind howled across the fields her great-great-grandfather had cleared with his bare hands. 8 days. She had 8 days left before everything her family had built turned into just another corporate acquisition. 8 days before the Clark name disappeared from land that had held it for nearly a century. And the man responsible for that deadline stood 10 feet away, asking her to listen. Tatiana tightened her grip on the pitchfork and made her decision. You've got 5 minutes, she said. Then you leave, And you don't come back. Caleb nodded slowly, relief and apprehension crossing his face in equal measure. 5 minutes. That's all I need. But they both knew 5 minutes wouldn't be enough. Not for what needed to be said. Not for 3 years of silence and betrayal and questions that had no easy answers. Not for a debt that couldn't be measured in money. Standing there in the frozen December air with Caleb Whitmore waiting. For her response, Tatiana's mind drifted back 26 years. She could almost see her 8-year-old self running through these same fields back when her mother was still alive, back when the farm meant adventure instead of survival. Her mother, Eleanor Clark, had died on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The cancer had taken her slowly, then all at once. Tatiana remembered the hospice nurse closing the bedroom curtains while her Father Graham stood in the hallway, his massive farmer's hands hanging, useless at his sides. She remembered the silence that followed, a silence that would define the rest of her childhood. After Eleanor died, it was just Tatiana and Graham on their 200-acre Wisconsin farm. Graham Clark was not a man who knew how to talk about grief. He knew how to work through it. The land itself held their family's entire history. Tatiana's great-great-grandfather, Thomas Clark, had bought the original 80 acres in 1923 with wages he'd saved from laying railroad tracks across the Midwest. He'd lived in a one-room cabin while clearing the fields by hand, married a school teacher named Margaret, and raised 3 sons who all learned to plow before they learned to read. Her great-grandfather expanded it to 120 acres during the Depression, somehow keeping the bank at bay when half the county went into foreclosure. Her grandfather added another 80 acres in the 1960s. Modernizing with equipment that seemed revolutionary at the time, her father, Graham, had inherited not just land, but a responsibility that went bone deep. 4 generations of Clarks had been born in the farmhouse. 3 generations had died there. Their names were carved into the oak tree behind the barn. Thomas, 1899 to 1967. James, 1924 to 1989. Robert, 1951 to 2018. Eleanor, 1973 to 2006. Each name represented a person who'd given their life to this soil, who'd trusted the next generation to keep it going. Tatiana had grown up knowing that someday her name would be carved there too. She just hadn't expected to be the last one. The Clark who lost what all the others had protected. Graham Clark believed in teaching through doing. The morning after Eleanor's funeral, he woke Tatiana at 5 a.m. and took her to the barn. "Your mother's gone," he said, his voice rough from crying he'd never admit to. "But the cows still need milking. The chickens still need feeding. This land doesn't care about your feelings. It only respects hard work." Those words became the foundation of Tatiana's education. He taught her to ride on a mare named Bessie, starting with how to approach the horse, slowly, how to read its moods in the flick of an ear or the stomp of a hoof. By age 10, she could saddle and bridle without help, could ride the fence lines checking for breaks, could tell if a horse was favoring a leg from 50 yards away. He taught her to read the Wisconsin sky like a map. The way clouds stacked meant rain within hours. The way wind shifted from south to west meant a storm was coming. The particular shade of grey-green that meant hail. The stillness that preceded the worst weather. She learned that nature always warned you if you knew how to listen. He taught her to hear what the wheat was saying, the rustle that meant it was ready for harvest. The particular way it bent meant too much nitrogen in the soil. The color that indicated disease creeping in. "The land talks," Graham would say. "Most people are just too loud to hear it." He taught her to repair engines with the patience of a surgeon. At 11, she could change oil and filters. At 12, she could diagnose why the tractor was running rough. At 13, she rebuilt her first carburetor on the kitchen table while Graham guided. Her hands, explaining how each piece connected to make the whole machine breathe. Every lesson came with the same underlying message. The farm was what mattered. Everything else was secondary. Your comfort, your social life, your dreams. All of it came after the land. By 14, Tatiana's days started at 4 a.m. No alarm clock needed. Her body had learned the rhythm. Feed the chickens, check the water troughs, milk the cows, muck the stalls, all before catching the 6:45 a.m. school bus where she'd try to finish homework, while her classmates talked about movies she'd never seen and parties she'd never attend. Her teachers called her gifted. Her English teacher, Mrs. Patterson, said she had a talent for writing that could take her anywhere. Her math teacher pushed her toward engineering. But Tatiana knew her future was already written in the soil of the Clark farm. At 16, she took over the farm's bookkeeping. Graham's eyesight was failing from diabetes he refused to properly treat. "Doctors are for dying," he'd say, even as Tatiana watched him squint at the ledgers, holding them inches from his face. She learned to balance accounts at the kitchen table after dinner, learned which bills could wait and which couldn't, learned to negotiate with suppliers over the phone, deepening her voice so they wouldn't dismiss her as a child, learned that the farm operated on margins thinner than paper, where one bad harvest or one sick animal could mean the difference between keeping the lights on and losing everything. She had friends at school, but they existed in a different world. They worried about homecoming dresses and college applications and boys who drove nice cars. Tatiana worried about whether the irrigation system would last another season and how much the vet bill would be if the dairy cow with the limp needed serious treatment. By 17, the distance between her life and theirs had grown too wide to cross. She ate lunch alone, did her homework on the bus, and went straight home to chores that never ended. The acceptance letter from Montana State University came on a Thursday in March of her senior year. Full scholarship for agricultural engineering, room and board included. A golden ticket out of the cycle of endless work and narrow margins. Renee Matthews, her only real friend, drove out to the farm that night, with a bottle of cheap champagne she'd gotten her older brother to buy. "You're going," Renee said, pouring the champagne into coffee mugs. No arguments. "You've given this place 18 years. You deserve a life." "Dad needs me," Tatiana said. "Your dad needs to hire help. You can't sacrifice your entire future for—" The rest of Renee's sentence was cut off by the sound of Graham's body hitting the kitchen floor. The stroke was massive. It left Graham's left side paralyzed, and his speech slurred. The doctors at Crawford County Hospital said he'd need months of rehabilitation, maybe years. He'd never work the farm again. Tatiana sent her regrets to Montana State the next week. The scholarship went to someone else, someone whose future wasn't already mortgaged to 200 acres of Wisconsin soil. She stayed, hired a part-time nurse for Graham with money they didn't have, ran the farm alone at 18 years old while her classmates went off to college, and freedom and lives that didn't revolve around livestock and crop rotations. Graham tried to apologize once, his words garbled and slow from the stroke damage. She'd stopped him. "This is what family does," she'd said. "We take care of each other. We protect what matters." She believed it then. Believed sacrifice meant something. Believed her choice would be honored somehow, that the universe kept accounts, and rewarded people who did the right thing even when it cost them everything. She didn't know yet how wrong she was. Graham died 3 years later on a July afternoon, sitting in his wheelchair at the edge of the wheat field. Tatiana found him there at sunset, his face peaceful, his good hand resting, on the arm of the chair like he'd just paused to watch the grain sway. The funeral was small. Neighbors came. A few distant cousins she barely knew. Renee drove in from Madison, where she was finishing her degree. But mostly it was just Tatiana, standing beside a casket, looking at the face of the only family she had left. Pastor Daniel Brooks said kind things about Graham's dedication to the land and his community, about a man who'd worked hard and raised his daughter to do the same, about faith and legacy and eternal rest. Tatiana barely heard any of it. She was doing math in her head, calculating what she'd inherited along with the farm. 200 acres of land worth approximately $600,000 if she could find a buyer quickly. Equipment worth maybe $80,000, most of it old enough to be more liability than asset. Livestock worth $120,000 if the market held, and debt. $327,000 in outstanding loans. Equipment purchases Graham had made trying to keep the farm competitive. Medical bills from his stroke that insurance hadn't covered. Credit cards he'd maxed out for diesel and feed and repairs that couldn't wait. The math was brutal. Even if she sold everything, she'd barely break even. And then she'd have nothing. No farm, no family, no purpose. So she kept it. Kept the farm and the debt and the impossible task of making it all work. Martin Doyle from First Wisconsin Bank wore a grey suit and a sympathetic expression. When he came to discuss the situation 3 days after the funeral, "Miss Clark," he said, sitting at the same kitchen table where her father had taught her to rebuild engines, "I understand this is a difficult time. The bank wants to work with you, but we need a plan." She was 21 years old, exhausted from grief, and facing a man who'd been in banking longer than she'd been alive. "Give me 1 year," she said. 1 year to catch up, and I'll never miss another payment. Martin looked at his paperwork. That's $327,000 plus interest. Call it $350,000. In 12 months, that's almost $30,000 a month. How exactly? "I'll sell the south 50 acres to the Hendersons. They've been wanting to expand. That's $150,000. I'll take a job in town. The night shift pays decently. I'll lease out the eastern 20 acres for corn. I'll make it work." "Miss Clark," Martin interrupted gently, "even with all that, the numbers are tight. What if you have a bad harvest? What if equipment breaks down? What if? Then I'll figure it out. This farm has survived the Depression and 2 world wars and every bad season in between. It'll survive this too." Something in her voice must have convinced him. Or maybe he just felt sorry for her. Either way, he gave her the year. She kept the farm. It cost her everything else. She sold the south 50 acres to Jim and Carol Henderson for $150,000. Watched them fence it off and plant their own crops on land her great-grandfather had cleared. It felt like selling a piece of her body. She took a job at Mary Lou Henderson's truck stop diner, working the overnight shift. Midnight to 8 a.m., 4 days a week. The pay was $18 an hour plus tips. She'd serve coffee to truckers and highway workers, clean tables and refill, ketchup bottles, then drive home at dawn to start her farm chores. She leased the eastern 20 acres to a corporate farming operation for $15,000 a year. Watched industrial equipment roll onto Clark land, worked by people who'd never met her great-great-grandfather, who didn't know the history buried in that soil. She lived on black coffee and whatever was quick. Peanut butter sandwiches, canned soup, eggs when the chickens were laying well. She lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. Stopped buying new clothes. Wore the same 3 pairs of jeans until they were more patchy than the original fabric. And somehow she made the payments. Scraped together $30,000 a month through sheer determination and stubbornness and refusing to let her father's legacy die with him. By the end of that year, she'd paid off the $350,000. The farm was hers, free and clear, for about 6 months. Then the equipment started breaking down. Then feed prices went up. Then diesel costs doubled. Then a disease swept through her cattle, and she lost 20 heads in 3 weeks. The debt came back. Slower this time, but inevitable. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Credit cards for emergency repairs, loans for replacement equipment. The cycle started again. By 28, Tatiana had no social life beyond brief conversations at the feed store. No relationships because what man wanted a woman who smelled like diesel fuel? And cow manure, who fell asleep during dinner from working 20-hour days. No holidays because animals didn't care about Christmas or Thanksgiving or the 4th of July. She existed in a loop of survival. Wake at 3:30 a.m., farm chores until 7 a.m., drive to whatever part-time job she'd picked up, back to the farm by 4 p.m. for evening chores, bookkeeping and maintenance until midnight, sleep for 3 hours. Repeat. Her hands became maps of calluses and scars. Her back ached constantly from lifting feed bags and hay bales. She looked older than her years, weathered, worn down by the relentless grind of keeping something alive that maybe should have been allowed to die. Renee had moved to Chicago by then, gotten married to a man named David. I had 2 kids. She sent Christmas cards with family photos that Tatiana tucked into the kitchen drawer, unable to look at them for long. That could have been her life. Should have been, maybe. But she'd made her choice at 18. And she was living with the consequences. The memory surfaced now as Tatiana stood in her frozen driveway, still gripping the pitchfork, still facing Caleb Whitmore. She could still feel the weight of that particular night 6 years ago, before she'd met him, before everything led to this moment. She'd been 2008, standing at the edge of the same wheat field where her father had died. The harvest moon hung low and orange over the horizon. She'd just finished 18 straight hours of combining, racing against a storm system moving in from the west. Her whole body ached. Her eyes burned from dust and exhaustion. She stood there looking over the fields her family had worked for 4 generations, and she'd wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. I wanted to walk away and never look back. But Clark women don't cry. That's what Eleanor had told her once, during the worst of the cancer treatments. Clark women don't cry. They endure. They survive. They keep going no matter what it costs them. So Tatiana had swallowed her tears, walked back to the farmhouse, and set her alarm for 3:30 a.m. She'd saved the farm that year. And the next. And the next. Until Whitmore Technologies bought her debt and called it due. Until the man she'd saved from freezing to death came back as the billionaire taking everything she'd sacrificed her life to protect. While Tatiana stood frozen in her driveway, holding on to memories of sacrifice and survival, the man before her carried his own history, one written in stock options and emptiness rather than soil and sweat. Caleb Whitmore had been born into comfort in Seattle, Washington, the first child of Preston and Evelyn Whitmore. His earliest memories weren't of fields or farms, but of his father's home office, where Preston worked 18-hour days building something he promised would change the world. Preston Whitmore had started with a single computer repair shop in downtown Seattle in 1985. By the time Caleb was walking, that shop had become 3 stores. By the time he started kindergarten, Preston had pivoted to software development. By middle school, Whitmore Technologies had become one of the fastest-growing cloud computing companies in North America. The transformation happened so gradually that young Caleb barely noticed. One day they lived in a modest suburban house with a used Honda in the driveway. The next, it seemed, they were moving into a 15,000-square-foot estate overlooking Puget Sound, with a fleet of cars and staff who called his mother Mrs. Whitmore with careful deference. Caleb was 12 years old when Whitmore Technologies went public. He remembered that day clearly because his father had actually come to his soccer game, the first and last time. Preston sat in the bleachers wearing a $5,000 suit, checking his phone every 30 seconds as the initial public offering numbers rolled in. By halftime, the family was worth $500 million on paper. By the end of the game, it was closer to $800 million. We're rich now, aren't we? Caleb had asked in the car afterward. Preston hadn't looked up from his phone. We're responsible now. Responsible to shareholders, to employees, to the market. Being rich is just a side effect of being necessary. That was Preston Whitmore. A man who saw wealth not as freedom but as obligation, success not as achievement but as the minimum acceptable outcome. Over the next 20 to 3 years, that initial fortune would grow to over $4 billion. Preston would expand Whitmore Technologies into cloud services, data centers, agricultural technology, and real estate. The company would employ over 50,000 people worldwide. The Whitmore name would become synonymous with innovation and ruthless efficiency. And Caleb would spend every single one of those years trying to earn his father's approval and failing. As Whitmore Technologies grew from $1 million company to $1 billion empire, the Whitmore family shrank into something that merely looked like a family in Christmas cards. Preston Whitmore lived at the office or on planes between offices. He had buildings in Seattle, San Francisco, New York, London, Tokyo. He spoke in quarterly earnings and market penetration, even at dinner on the rare occasions he was home. His children became metrics to be optimized, grades, achievements, representations of the Whitmore brand. Evelyn Whitmore responded to her husband's absence by constructing her own elaborate performance of the perfect executive's wife. She chaired charity boards, organized galas, appeared at the right restaurants with the right people. She smiled for photographers while, washing down anxiety medication with champagne, maintained her figure with prescription appetite suppressants, and scheduled her emotions for 45-minute sessions with a therapist who charged $500 an hour. By the time she tucked her children into bed, when she remembered to, her eyes were glassy and unfocused, seeing through them rather than actually seeing them. The Whitmore house was enormous and silent. 15,000 square feet of marble and glass, where 3 people lived separate lives under the same roof. Caleb would go days without seeing his father. His mother existed in a pharmaceutical fog, present but not really there. Caleb's younger sister Iris took a different path. Where Caleb sought perfection to earn their father's attention, Iris sought chaos to demand it. At 14, she was expelled from her first private school for selling pills to classmates. At 16, she crashed a $200,000 car into the gates of their own estate. At 18, she dated a drummer from a band Preston had never heard of, then a graffiti artist who went by a single name, then nobody at all for 6 months while she checked into a facility that called itself a wellness retreat but was really rehab. "At least I'm honest about being broken," Iris told Caleb once, during a rare moment of clarity between crises. "You're just as empty as me. You're just better at hiding it." Caleb had wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. Iris's rebellion was loud and destructive and impossible to ignore. But it was also honest. She wasn't pretending to be fine. Wasn't performing the role of the perfect daughter. She was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with their family, and nobody wanted to hear it. So they sent her to therapists and treatment centers and specialized programs. They wrote checks to make the problems disappear. But they never actually listened to what she was trying to say. If Iris chose rebellion, Caleb chose its opposite, flawless execution of the role of Preston Whitmore's son. He graduated from Lakeside School with a 4 gigapascals and perfect SAT scores. He played varsity tennis not because he loved it, but because it looked good on applications. He dated appropriate girls from appropriate families. He smiled in family photos and gave quotes to business journals about following in his father's innovative footsteps while feeling absolutely nothing inside. Harvard accepted him for undergraduate studies. He majored in economics with a minor in computer science, graduated summa cum laude, and delivered a valedictory speech about the intersection of technology and human potential that he'd forgotten by the next morning. Harvard Business School came next. Then internships at Goldman Sachs and McKinsey. Then a strategic rotation through every division of Whitmore Technologies. Each position perfectly calculated to build his resume, to prove his worth. To finally earn something from Preston beyond a nod and a critique. He did everything right, said the right things, made the right connections, closed the right deals, built the perfect resume that would position him to eventually take over Whitmore Technologies when Preston finally stepped down. And he felt nothing. Nothing at all. But Preston Whitmore was impossible to satisfy. When Caleb closed his first $1 million deal at 25, Preston said, "I'd closed 10 times that by your age." When Caleb was featured in Forbes 30 Under 30, Preston said, "Features are for people who haven't actually done anything yet." When Caleb took over the struggling Pacific Northwest division and turned it profitable within a year, Preston said, "You had every advantage. You've never had to fight for anything. You're not hungry enough." That was the word Preston always used. Hungry. As if Caleb could somehow develop an appetite for something he'd been force-fed since birth. As if growing up with everything meant you could suddenly pretend to need something. "You don't know what it's like to risk everything," Preston told him once, during a particularly harsh performance review. "You don't know what it's like to really want something because you've never been without anything. Everything you've accomplished with a safety net, with my name behind you, with resources most people never dream of having. And maybe Preston was right. Maybe Caleb had never truly struggled, never truly risked anything, never truly wanted anything badly enough to sacrifice for it, until he met Tatiana Clark and discovered what hunger actually felt like. By 35 years old, Caleb was everything Preston had groomed him to be, and nothing he'd chosen for himself. He ran Whitmore Technologies' real estate and agricultural division, overseeing land, acquisitions for data centers, solar farms, and agricultural technology projects. His division had grown 400% in 3 years. He'd been on the cover of 6 major business magazines. His net worth, independent of his inheritance, was approaching $100 million, and he felt absolutely nothing. His relationships were transactions. He dated women who looked impressive at galas and understood that he would never call them after the 3rd date. He had business partners, not friends. He had staff, not companions. His penthouse apartment in Seattle was featured in Architectural Digest, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal there that wasn't delivered by someone paid to bring it. Success looked exactly like his father had promised, and it was completely hollow. The emptiness was worse at 3 a.m. That was when Caleb would find himself standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse looking out at the Seattle skyline, feeling like he was watching someone else's life from very far away. The city sparkled below him, millions of lives happening simultaneously. People with real problems and real joys and real connections, while he stood above it all, insulated by glass and money and the terrible realization that he didn't actually exist. He existed as a function, as a role, as Caleb Whitmore, son of Preston Whitmore, executive at Whitmore Technologies. But underneath all that, nothing. A void where a person should have been. Sometimes he wondered if this was what his mother felt when she took her pills. If this was what drove Iris to her chaos. This fundamental absence at the center of everything, this sense that they were all just very expensive puppets dancing for an audience that had already left the theater. He'd tried therapy. The therapist had asked him what he wanted, and Caleb had sat there for the entire 50-minute session unable to answer. He didn't know what he wanted. He'd never been allowed to want anything that wasn't already predetermined by his last name and his father's expectations. He'd tried hobbies, collected art he didn't care about, joined exclusive clubs where everyone talked about money in slightly different languages. I traveled to destinations that looked stunning in photos and felt empty in person. Nothing worked. Nothing filled the void. He was 35 years old, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, positioned to inherit billions. And he would have traded it all for one moment of actually feeling something real. December had started like any other year-end push. Numbers to hit, deals to close, presentations to perfect. Timothy Caldwell, his senior acquisitions manager, had walked into Caleb's office on December 10th with a folder marked Wisconsin Agricultural Consolidation. "This is the one we've been working on for 18 months, Timothy said, laying out the paperwork with practiced efficiency. 10,000 acres total, assembled from 17 different parcels. 3 family farms, 6 commercial operations, and 8 plots of undeveloped land. Total investment, $47 million. Projected ROI. Once we implement the automated farming systems, 300% within 5 years. Caleb flipped through the documents, seeing numbers and projection charts, not names or histories. One page showed an aerial view of the assembled land, a perfect rectangle of possibility bordered by highways and rail lines, ideal for their purposes. "The family farms?" Caleb asked, more out of habit than concern. 3 generational operations, all struggling financially. "We've acquired their debt from local banks at 70 cents on the dollar, standard foreclosure and acquisition. They have until December 31st to pay in full or vacate. Any issues?" "One of them, the Clark Farm. The owner's been particularly resistant to our buyout offers, but it's handled. Legal says we're clear on all 17 properties." Caleb signed the authorization without reading the names. It was just business. It was always just business. 3 families losing their generational land was just collateral damage in a $47 million investment that would generate returns for Whitmore Technologies shareholders. He didn't think about the people, didn't consider what those farms meant to the families who'd worked them, didn't connect the numbers on the page to actual human lives being disrupted, just like his father had trained him. Something made him decide to visit the Wisconsin properties personally. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was the need to feel something, anything, even if it was just the satisfaction of seeing a deal completed. Maybe it was Preston's voice in his head, calling him soft, saying he never got his hands dirty. "Mr. Whitmore," his assistant Jennifer said when he told her about the trip, "the Weather Service is predicting a major storm system moving through Wisconsin around December 23rd and 24th. Perhaps you should postpone until after the holidays." "I'll be fine," he said. "Book a rental car at the airport, something with four-wheel drive." "Sir, the forecast is calling for potentially dangerous conditions, possibly the worst storm Crawford County has seen in decades. Jennifer, I've driven in snow before. I'll leave early, tour the properties, and be back before Christmas." "It's fine." She wanted to argue. He could see it in her face. But she was too professional, too well paid to push back against his confidence. She booked the flights, reserved a Lincoln Navigator at the Madison airport, and sent him an itinerary. That would have him touring the properties on December 23rd and 24th. "The Clark property is the last on the list," she said. "Without it, the entire consolidation project doesn't work. It's the centerpiece that connects all the other parcels." "I'll make sure to see it," Caleb said. What he really wanted was to feel something, to stand on land that would soon be transformed by his decision, and maybe, finally, experience whatever it was that Preston felt when he built his empire. That hunger, that drive, that purpose. He had no idea that the storm would be the worst Crawford County had seen in 40 years. He had no idea that his rental car would slide off Highway 12 into a ditch. He had no idea that Tatiana Clark, the woman whose farm he was about to take, would be the one to save his life. He had no idea that 2 days on a failing Wisconsin farm would wake him, up in ways that 35 years of wealth and privilege never had. And he had no idea that 3 years later he'd be standing in her driveway trying to explain the inexplicable, trying to fix the unfixable, trying to prove that he was more than just another billionaire using his resources to take what he wanted. 3 years before Caleb stood in Tatiana's frozen driveway trying to explain the inexplicable, he'd been driving through rural Wisconsin in a luxury Lincoln Navigator that cost more than most people earned in 2 years. The vehicle was ridiculous for the circumstances. Leather seats with heating and cooling functions, a sound system engineered for acoustic perfection, navigation screens that displayed real-time traffic data for roads that hadn't seen traffic in hours. All of it utterly useless against the reality forming outside the tinted windows. Caleb wore a Burberry wool coat over a tailored suit, Italian leather shoes that had never touched anything rougher than marble floors, and a watch that cost $45,000. His emergency supplies consisted of a half-empty water bottle, some breath mints, and his phone charger. He'd declined the rental agent's offer of an emergency kit because it seemed excessive. "You're all set, Mr. Whitmore," the young woman at the counter had said. "But just so you know, there's a storm warning for the next 40 to 8 hours. We have emergency kits available for $30 if you'd like to add one to your rental." "I'll be fine," he'd said, signing the paperwork without looking up. "I've driven in snow before." He'd driven in snow before. In Seattle, on well-maintained highways with plows running every hour and gas stations every few miles. This was something else entirely. The storm had started gently. Flurries dancing across the windshield, beautiful in their way, almost romantic if you were the type to find romance in weather. Caleb wasn't. By the time he reached Crawford County, the flurries had become serious snowfall. By the time he turned onto Highway 12, visibility had dropped to maybe 50 feet. The GPS kept recalculating his route, the blue line on the screen zigzagging, as satellite signals bounced unreliably off storm clouds. The road disappeared gradually. First the center line vanished under fresh accumulation, then the shoulder markers, then any distinction between pavement and field, between where it was safe to drive and where the ditch began. Caleb slowed to 20 miles per hour, then 15, then 10. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. His eyes burned from staring into the white void ahead, searching for something to orient himself by. Recalculating the route, the GPS said for the 5th time in as many minutes, "It's calm." Voice absurdly confident in a situation that was rapidly becoming anything but. At some point, Caleb decided to turn around. This was insane. He was a billionaire executive, driving through a blizzard to look at farmland his company had already legally acquired. The smart move was to find the nearest hotel, wait out the storm, tour the properties when the weather cleared. Preston might call that soft, but Preston wasn't here watching the world disappear into white chaos. Caleb slowed to a stop, put the navigator in reverse, and began a careful 3-point turn on what he hoped was still the road. That's when the landscape shifted. The vehicle lurched suddenly, tilting at an angle that sent Caleb's stomach into his throat. He'd gone off the road, and now the navigator was sliding sideways down what might have been an embankment, or might have been a ditch, or might have been the edge of the world for all he could see. He spun the wheel, pumped the brakes, did everything he'd been taught in the one defensive driving course he'd taken years ago in Seattle. None of it mattered. The navigator hit something solid, with a sound like the world breaking. The airbags exploded. Caleb's head snapped forward, then back. Pain bloomed across his chest where the seatbelt caught him. His vision went white, then red, then black. When Caleb opened his eyes, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The engine had died. The heating system had shut down. The GPS screen was dark. Even the small green lights on the dashboard had gone out, leaving him in near total darkness, broken only by the weak grey light filtering through snow-covered windows. He tried to move and discovered new categories of pain. His ribs screamed. His left wrist throbbed. His face felt wet. Blood, he realized, running from a cut above his eyebrow where he'd struck something during the impact. He reached for his phone. No signal. Of course no signal. He was somewhere in rural Wisconsin, buried in a disabled vehicle, in the middle of a blizzard. Cell towers didn't help people like him when they made stupid decisions like this. The cold crept in quickly. Within minutes, he could see his breath. Within 10 minutes, he was shivering despite his expensive coat. Within 20, he understood that staying in the vehicle meant freezing to death slowly instead of quickly. Caleb sat in the dead SUV, bleeding and freezing, and experienced something completely foreign to his existence. The absolute irrelevance of his wealth. He was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had access to resources that could move mountains, change industries, and influence policy. He could buy companies, buildings, entire city blocks with a phone call. But none of that mattered here. His money couldn't make the phone work. His connections couldn't summon help through a blizzard. His education hadn't taught him how to start a fire or build a shelter or survive conditions that his ancestors would have understood were lethal. For the first time in his life, Caleb Whitmore was truly helpless. And the terror of that realization was almost worse than the cold. He decided to walk because staying seemed worse. The logic was simple. The car was getting colder, he was getting colder. Therefore, moving had to be better than sitting still. He remembered seeing lights in the distance before the crash. Farmhouses, maybe. If he could just find one, if he could just keep moving, he'd be fine. He pushed open the door against a snowdrift and stepped out into a world that immediately tried to kill him. The wind hit like a physical force, stealing his breath and his balance simultaneously. The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was flying horizontally, tiny ice particles that stung exposed skin like thrown sand. The cold went through his designer coat like it was tissue paper. Caleb chose a direction based on nothing but instinct and started walking. Within minutes, he was completely lost. The navigator disappeared behind him into the white void. Every direction looked identical. The snow beneath his feet varied from ankle-deep to thigh-deep with no warning, sending him stumbling and falling repeatedly. His leather shoes filled with snow that melted against his skin, then seemed to freeze again, each step becoming agony. His hands went numb first, then his feet, then his face. His thoughts began to slow, like a computer running out of processing power. The danger of hypothermia is how gentle it feels at the end. First came the shivering, violent and uncontrollable, his body's last desperate attempt to generate heat. Then came the confusion, his mind unable to hold on to thoughts for more than a few seconds. The farmhouse lights he was searching for might have been real or might have been hallucinations born of desperate hope. His movements became uncoordinated. He stumbled more frequently, stayed down longer after each fall. His breathing slowed. His heartbeat became irregular, skipping and stuttering in his chest like an engine misfiring. At some point, Caleb fell into a snowbank and couldn't get up. He tried. He pushed against the snow with hands that no longer felt connected to his arms. But his muscles wouldn't respond. His body had given up before his mind had fully accepted what was happening. This is how I die, he thought with surprising clarity, frozen in a ditch in Wisconsin. They won't find me for days, maybe weeks. Preston will give a statement about how tragic it is. Iris will get drunk at the funeral. And none of it will matter because I'll be dead. He closed his eyes. The cold didn't hurt anymore. That was a strange thing. It had gone from painful to almost comfortable, like slipping into a warm bath. While Caleb lay dying 2 miles away, Tatiana Clark was fighting to save a different life. Her oldest mare, Buttercup, had gone into labor 6 weeks early. The contractions had started at 8 p.m., just as the storm reached its peak intensity. Tatiana had called Dr. Susan Pennington, the only large animal vet within, 50 miles, but Susan's truck couldn't make it through the drifts. "Talk me through it," Susan had said over the phone, shouting to be heard over static. "You've seen enough births. You can do this." Tatiana had delivered calves before, even a few foals, but never alone, never in conditions like this, never with a mare as old as Buttercup struggling with a breech presentation. For 2 hours she worked in the barn while the storm screamed outside. Her hands shook from adrenaline and fear as she guided the foal into position, as she helped Buttercup push as she finally pulled the tiny creature into the world and cleared its airways and watched its small chest rise and fall with its first breaths. The foal was a filly, dark and wet and perfect. "Hope," Tatiana whispered, stroking the newborn's neck. "I'm going to call you Hope." Tatiana was cleaning up, washing blood from her hands in a bucket of frigid water, when she heard it. A sound that didn't match the storm. Not wind, not branches breaking under snow weight, not the barn door rattling. Something else. Something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She stood still, listening. There it was again. A thud, a cry. Something muffled and distant and wrong. Her father had taught her to trust her instincts about the land. "If something feels off," he'd said, "it usually is." Tatiana grabbed her heavy flashlight, pulled on her father's old emergency pack, and stepped out into the blizzard. She found him 20 yards from her property line, half buried in a drift that had formed against the fence. At first, she thought it was debris blown by the wind. Then her flashlight caught the dark shape of a coat, the outline of a hand, the pale oval of a face pressed into the snow. A person, face down and motionless. Tatiana dropped to her knees beside him, her heart hammering. She rolled him onto his back and saw blood frozen on his forehead, lips blue with cold, eyes closed. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, searching for a pulse. For a terrible moment, she felt nothing. Then there, faint and slow but present. He was alive, barely. She had seconds to make a choice. This was a stranger who'd wandered onto her land in the middle of a killing storm. Helping him meant risking herself, meant dragging his weight back through conditions that could kill them both. But Tatiana Clark was her father's daughter. And you don't leave people to die, even strangers, even when helping them costs you something. She grabbed him under his arms and started dragging. Tatiana pressed her fingers harder against the stranger's neck, desperate to feel that faint pulse again. There, still there, weak as a whisper but present. She had no time for careful planning. The storm was getting worse, and his body temperature was dropping by the second. Every moment she delayed meant his chances decreased. Tatiana grabbed him under both arms and pulled. He was heavy, easily 180 pounds of dead weight, and her own body was already exhausted from delivering hope. Her back screamed in protest. Her shoulders burned. Her legs shook with effort as she dragged him inch by inch through the snow toward the barn. 20 yards had never felt so far. She fell twice, her boots losing traction on ice hidden beneath fresh powder. Each time she forced herself back up, repositioned her grip, and kept pulling. Her hands went numb inside her gloves. Her lungs burned from breathing frozen air. But she refused to leave him, refused to go get help or equipment or anything. That would mean abandoning him alone in the snow even for 30 seconds. Graham's voice echoed in her head. You commit to saving something, you see it through. No half measures. By the time she got him into the barn, her vision was blurring from exhaustion. She considered stopping there, wrapping him in horse blankets and warming him near Buttercup's stall. But the barn wasn't warm enough, not for hypothermia this severe. She had to get him to the house. Another 100 feet through the storm. Another eternity of dragging and falling and pulling and praying. When she finally got him through the farmhouse door, she collapsed. Beside him on the floor, gasping for breath, her muscles trembling. But she couldn't rest. Not yet. Tatiana had never treated severe hypothermia before, but she'd read enough, and heard enough stories from other farmers to know the basics. Warm him slowly. Too fast could shock his system and kill him. Remove wet clothes. Replace with dry layers. Monitor his breathing. She stripped off his soaked designer coat, the expensive fabric now just dead weight holding cold against his skin. The suit underneath was equally wet. The shirt. Everything had to go. Her hands shook as she worked, partly from cold, partly from the intimacy of undressing an unconscious stranger. She kept her focus clinical, mechanical. This wasn't a man. This was a patient. This was someone who would die if she let embarrassment slow her down. She wrapped him in the quilts her grandmother had made, layer after layer of cotton and batting that had kept 3 generations of Clarks warm through Wisconsin winters. She built up the fire in the wood stove until the small living room glowed with heat. She filled hot water bottles and tucked them carefully against his core, not his extremities. She remembered that warning. Warm the core first. She made tea, chamomile and honey, and tried to get him to swallow. Most of it dribbled down his chin, but some went down. That was something. His breathing was shallow but steady. His pulse remained weak but present. She checked both every few minutes, terrified that one of those checks would find nothing. Tatiana settled into the chair beside the couch where she'd laid him, wrapped in her own blanket, and watched his chest rise and fall. The fear came in waves. What if he stopped breathing? What if she'd done something wrong? What if he died right here in her living room and it was somehow her fault? To keep herself awake, to push back against the terror of watching someone hover between life and death, she started talking. At first, just observations. Your breathing sounds better. That's good. The colors coming back to your face. Then, as the hours stretched on and the storm continued to rage outside, she talked about other things. She told him about the farm's history, about Thomas Clark buying this land with railroad wages in 1923, about her great-grandmother Margaret who taught school while helping clear the fields, about her grandfather surviving the Depression by selling eggs door to door. She told him about her father, Graham, about his rough hands and his quiet wisdom, about how he'd taught her that hard work was the only currency the land accepted. He died out there, she said, gesturing toward the window, even though it showed nothing but white darkness. In the wheat field, just sat down in his wheelchair and decided he was done. I think he chose it that way, chose to go out surrounded by what he'd spent his life protecting. She told him about Hope, the foal born just hours ago. She shouldn't have survived. 6 weeks early, breech presentation, no vet. But she did. She's in the barn right now, probably sleeping next to her mama. I named her Hope because that's what tonight feels like hoping things turn out okay, even when the odds are terrible. Around 3 a.m., when her voice was getting hoarse and her exhaustion was becoming dangerous, she started singing. Her mother Eleanor had sung hymns every Christmas Eve. Old ones, traditional ones, the kind that sounded like they belonged in small country churches with worn hymnals. Tatiana hadn't sung them since her mother died, but the words came back now, muscle memory from childhood. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Her voice cracked on some notes, but she kept going, singing to a dying stranger to keep herself awake, to fill the terrible silence, to remember her mother who'd been gone for 26 years. The first light was creeping through the windows when the stranger's eyes finally opened. Tatiana saw it immediately. She'd been watching his face so closely for so long that even the slight flutter of his eyelids registered like an alarm bell. "Hey," she said, leaning forward. "Can you hear me?" His eyes moved slowly, trying to focus. Confusion clouded his features. He tried to speak, managing only a rough sound that might have been a question. "You're safe," Tatiana said. "You were caught in the storm. I found you. You're in my farmhouse." He blinked slowly, processing. His lips moved. "Cold. You were hypothermic. You're warming up now. Don't try to move too fast." "Who?" "Tatiana. Tatiana Clark. This is my farm." He stared at her like he was trying to reconcile her existence with his memory of the storm, the crash, the certainty of death. "You saved me." "Yeah, well, couldn't exactly leave you out there to freeze. Thank you." The words came out broken, raw with emotion that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "Don't thank me yet. You're still recovering. And when you're feeling better, we need to have a serious conversation about how monumentally stupid you were to be driving in that storm." By mid-morning, the stranger was conscious enough to sit up, though his movements were slow and painful. Tatiana brought him more tea and some toast, watching critically as he ate. In the daylight, she could see him more clearly. Mid-30s, she guessed. Dark hair, strong features, hands that had clearly never done manual labor. His clothes, even soaked and ruined, had been expensive. The watch on his wrist probably cost more than her truck. "You're an idiot," she said bluntly. He looked up, startled. "Excuse me? An idiot? Driving through a blizzard in a suit and dress shoes with no emergency supplies. What were you thinking?" "I thought I could make it." "Why?" "Because you've driven in snow before. This isn't Seattle rain. This is a Wisconsin blizzard. People die in storms like that. You almost died." He had the grace to look ashamed. "You're right. I was arrogant. I don't know what I thought. What's your name?" He hesitated, just for a second. "Caleb." "Caleb what?" "Just Caleb." "What about you?" "Tatiana Clark." "I already told you that, but you were pretty out of it." She didn't press him on the last name. People had their reasons for privacy, and honestly, she was too tired to care. She'd saved his life. That was enough for now. The phone lines were down. The power flickered on and off. The County Road Commission called the storm historic on the radio, and said main roads wouldn't be passable for at least 48 hours. Caleb was stuck. "I can't impose on you," he said. "Maybe I can walk to town, or..." "With what shoes? Yours are ruined, and the town is 12 miles away. You'd freeze before you made it too. Then I'll pay you for the inconvenience." "With what?" "Your wallet's probably still in your rental car, wherever that ended up. And I don't want your money anyway." "Then, how can I repay you?" Tatiana handed him a pair of work gloves. "You can help with chores. If you're strong enough to sit up, you're strong enough to work. The farm doesn't stop for storms or stranded strangers." Caleb learned quickly that his gym-sculpted body meant nothing in the context of actual physical work. Tatiana had him mucking stalls, hauling feed bags, splitting wood for the stove. Tasks she did every day without thinking about them left him gasping and sore within an hour. "How do you do this every day?" he asked, leaning on a shovel in the barn, his back screaming. "Practice. And necessity. When it's just you, you figure it out or you lose everything." His hands, soft from years of office work and catered meals, blistered within the first afternoon. Tatiana tossed him a tube of ointment without sympathy. Welcome to farming. But he kept working. Partly because he had no choice, partly because there was something satisfying about it. The tasks had clear beginnings and endings. Muck the stall, and the stall is clean. Split the wood, and you have firewood. Simple cause and effect in a life that had been nothing but complicated abstractions for years. He met Hope, the newborn foal, and stood in amazement as the little creature wobbled on uncertain legs, nursing from her mother. "She's beautiful," he said. "She's a miracle," Tatiana corrected. "She shouldn't be alive, but she fought for it." Caleb watched the foal and felt something shift inside him. Something about the simplicity of it. Life wanting to live. Struggling against impossible odds just for the chance to exist. When was the last time he'd fought for anything? Over those 2 days, they talked, not about specifics. He didn't mention Whitmore Technologies, and she didn't pry into his obvious wealth. But they talked about broader things, about what mattered. Tatiana told him about turning down her scholarship, about her father's stroke, about the choice between her future and her family's legacy. "Do you regret it?" Caleb asked. "Every day, and never." "Does that make sense?" "More than you know." He told her about working for his father, about chasing approval that never came, about success that felt hollow. "I have everything I'm supposed to want," he said, "and I feel nothing. Is that ungrateful?" "It's honest," Tatiana said. "There's a difference." They didn't talk about relationships or romance or the strange intimacy of two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They talked about purpose and meaning and the exhausting work of trying to matter in a world that didn't seem to care. On Christmas Eve, Tatiana made dinner from what she had. Canned soup, bread she'd baked 3 days earlier, preserves from last summer's harvest. It was simple, almost embarrassingly so, but Caleb ate like it was the best meal he'd had in years. After dinner, she pulled out a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet above the refrigerator. "This was my dad's. He saved it for special occasions, but he died before he could drink it. Seems like tonight qualifies." They sat in front of the wood stove, passing the bottle back and forth, talking about grief and duty and loneliness. "You know what's funny?" Caleb said, his words slightly loosened by alcohol. "I've been to 100 Christmas parties. Expensive events with catering and entertainment and everything money can buy. And I've never felt as present as I do right now, drinking whiskey in a farmhouse with someone I met 2 days ago. That's because those parties weren't real," Tatiana said. "This is real. The storm is real. The work is real. This conversation is real. You can feel the difference. How do you stay strong through all of it? The loss, the work, the loneliness. I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." She took another sip. "And strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just enduring. Just getting up the next day and doing it again because that's what needs to happen." Before they went to sleep that night, Tatiana in her room and Caleb on the couch with the quilts, he stopped her. "Tatiana? Yeah? Thank you. Not just for saving my life, for treating me like a person. You didn't ask who I was, what I could give you, what I was worth. You just treated me like I mattered as a human being. I can't remember the last time someone did that." She looked at him for a long moment. "Everyone's a person, Caleb. Some people just forget it. The money, the success, the status, that's all window dressing. Underneath, we're all just trying to survive and hoping we matter to someone. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Could you do what Tatiana did? Would you risk your own safety to drag a stranger to safety in a blizzard? Would you give up your Christmas to care for someone you didn't know? Drop a comment and tell me. And if this story is resonating with you, if it's making you feel something, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in the goodness that still exists in people. Now, back to Christmas morning. By Christmas morning, the storm had passed. The county plows had cleared Highway 12. Tatiana got a call from the tow company. They'd found Caleb's rental navigator and hauled it to their lot in town. Total loss, but his belongings were salvageable. "I can drive you to the bus station," Tatiana offered. The town's about 40 minutes away. They didn't talk much during the drive. Caleb stared out the window at the landscape transformed by snow, at the farm disappearing. In the rearview mirror, at this brief glimpse of a different life fading behind him. At the station he tried to find the words. "Can I see you again?" Tatiana smiled, but it was sad. "No, Caleb. People like you don't end up with people like me. You've got a life waiting for you somewhere. Probably a good one. I've got this farm, and nothing else. Let's not pretend there's a version of this that works. But you don't even know my last name. I don't know yours. Let's keep it that way. You'll go back to your world. I'll stay in mine, and we'll both remember these 2 days as something good that happened during a storm. Sometimes that's enough." He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that this mattered, that he felt more alive in her farmhouse than he had in years of his real life. But she'd already turned away, climbing back into her pickup, leaving him standing in front of the bus station with nothing but the clothes she'd lent him and a feeling he couldn't name. Caleb sat on the bus heading back to Chicago, watching Wisconsin roll past the window, and realized something had fundamentally shifted inside him. 2 days ago, he'd been numb, empty, going through the motions of a life that looked perfect on paper but felt like nothing at all. Now he felt everything. The ache of leaving, the confusion of wanting something he couldn't have, the realization that Tatiana Clark, a woman who worked herself to exhaustion for a failing farm, had more purpose in her little finger than he had in his entire existence. He didn't have her number, didn't know exactly where her farm was. The details had been lost in the fog of hypothermia and recovery. She was gone. The moment was gone. But the feeling she'd awakened in him, the sense that life could actually mean something, that stayed. And as the bus carried him back toward his empty penthouse and his hollow success, Caleb Whitmore felt more alive than he had in 35 years. Caleb returned to his penthouse apartment 3 days after Christmas to find everything exactly as he'd left it. The same pristine kitchen he never cooked in, the same expensive furniture he never truly noticed, the same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that suddenly felt like it existed behind glass, something he observed but never actually touched. His assistant Jennifer had left a stack of messages on his desk, meetings he'd missed, calls to return, deals waiting for his signature. The machinery of his life was ready to resume the moment he stepped back into it. But something was broken. He stood at those windows at 3 a.m. like he always had, but now instead of feeling nothing, he felt the absence of something specific. The silence of the farm, the crackle of the wood stove, Tatiana's voice telling him that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just enduring. He'd spent 2 days doing real work with real consequences, and now he was back to pushing money around on spreadsheets, calling it productivity. The contrast was devastating. Caleb tried to find her. The problem was, he knew almost nothing. Her first name was Tatiana. She had a farm somewhere in Crawford County, Wisconsin. That was it. He started with internet searches. Tatiana Farmer, Wisconsin, Crawford County returned thousands of useless results. He tried property records, but without a last name, he was searching blind. After 2 weeks of getting nowhere, he hired Leonard Price, a private investigator who specialized in discreet inquiries for wealthy clients. "I need you to find someone," Caleb said at their first meeting. "A woman named Tatiana. She owns a farm in Crawford County, Wisconsin." "That's all I have." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "That's not much to work with, Mr. Whitmore. Do you know approximately how large the farm is? Any distinguishing features?" Caleb thought back. She mentioned her great-great-grandfather bought the land with railroad wages in the 1920s. 4 generations of her family have worked it. She has horses. She lost her mother young, raised by her father who died a few years ago. "That's better. I'll start with property records, cross-reference with historical land grants, and look for generational ownership patterns. It'll take time. Take whatever time you need. Just find her." But weeks turned into months, and Leonard kept hitting dead ends. Crawford County had dozens of generational farms. Without more specific information, the search was nearly impossible. The next 6 months were torture. Caleb went through the motions of his life with mechanical precision. He attended board meetings, closed acquisition deals, gave presentations about market expansion and projected growth. On paper, it looked like success. Inside, he was screaming. Every deal felt pointless. Every luxury felt obscene. He'd sit in five-star restaurants with business partners, eating meals that cost more than Tatiana probably spent on groceries in a month, and feel sick. His penthouse, once a symbol of his success, became a prison. He'd wake up at dawn, his body still on farm time somehow, and have nothing to do. No animals to feed, no real work that mattered, just conference calls and emails and the endless performance of being Caleb Whitmore, billionaire executive. He started declining social invitations, stopped dating the appropriate women his circle expected him to date, spent his evenings alone, drinking his father's expensive scotch, and remembering what it felt like to split wood in the cold, to feel his muscles burn with actual productive effort. Preston noticed, "You've been distracted since that Wisconsin trip. What happened out there?" "Nothing." Caleb lied. "Just a car accident." "Storm, I'm fine." "You don't seem fine. You seem checked out." "I'm hitting all my targets, aren't I?" "Targets aren't the point. The hunger is. You've lost it again." Caleb wanted to laugh. He'd finally found hunger, a real desire for something meaningful, and it was for a life he couldn't have with a woman he couldn't find. While Caleb searched for her from his Seattle tower, Tatiana was fighting for survival. The year after that, Christmas was the hardest of her life. In February, a respiratory disease swept through her cattle. She lost 20 heads before the vet could get it under control. 20 animals, gone. That was $40,000 in lost value, plus the cost of treating the survivors, plus the income she wouldn't make from selling them at market. In April, the tractor, the same one her grandfather had bought in 1970, and her father had maintained with religious devotion, finally died. The engine seized completely, unfixable even by the mechanic in town who'd been keeping it running on prayers and spare parts for the last 5 years. A new tractor was $80,000 minimum. A decent used one was $35,000. She had neither. She borrowed a neighbor's equipment for planting season, paying him in labor. 18-hour days working his fields and hers, sleeping 4 hours a night, living on coffee and stubbornness. Feed prices went up. Fuel costs increased. The price she could get for her wheat at harvest dropped because of market oversupply. Every number worked against her. She ate one real meal a day, usually just eggs from her chickens and bread she baked herself. She wore the same 3 sets of clothes until they were more patchy than the original fabric. She stopped heating the farmhouse, except for the kitchen and her bedroom. Every penny went to keeping the farm operational for one more season. Martin Doyle from First Wisconsin Bank became a regular unwelcome visitor. The first time he came after the cattle loss was in March. "Miss Clark, we need to discuss your account status. You're 4 months behind again. I'll catch up after harvest. That's what you said last year. The bank needs assurances." "What kind of assurances?" "A payment plan. Collateral. Something that shows you're able to meet your obligations." She gave him a payment plan she couldn't afford. He accepted it knowing she'd fail. He came back in June. "You've missed 3 payments on the plan we agreed to. The cattle disease set me back. The tractor died. I told you that. The bank sympathizes, but sympathy doesn't pay loans. I need to be honest with you, Tatiana. If you can't come up with a substantial payment by year's end, we're going to have to move forward with foreclosure proceedings." "How substantial?" $523,000. That would cover the overdue payments and bring your account current." She'd laughed. Actually, I laughed because the alternative was screaming. "Martin, I don't have $500,000. I don't have 50,000. I barely have 5,000. Then I suggest you start looking at your options. Selling more land, perhaps. Bringing in a partner. Something." Tatiana tried everything. She called Renee Matthews in Chicago. "I know this is asking a lot, but I'm in trouble. Real trouble. Is there any way you could?" "Tatiana, I would if I could. But David just got laid off. We're living on my income, and it's tight. I don't have anything to spare." She talked to her neighbors, the Hendersons, about buying more land. They'd already purchased her south 50 acres years ago. "We'd like to help," Jim Henderson said, his weathered face sympathetic. "But we're stretched thin ourselves." Everyone is. It's not like the old days. She took a part-time job cleaning offices in town at 4 a.m. before her farm work started. The irony of scrubbing floors for minimum wage while owing $500,000 wasn't lost on her. It paid $400 a week. Against a $500,000 debt, it was meaningless. Every door she knocked on closed before she could get the words out. The official notice came on December 20th. Martin Doyle delivered it himself instead of mailing it. That should have told her something. "Tatiana," he said, standing on her porch with an envelope in his hands and genuine regret on his face. "I'm sorry. The bank has sold your debt." Her stomach dropped. Sold it? To whom? A company called Whitmore Agricultural Holdings. It's a subsidiary of Whitmore Technologies. They've been buying up agricultural debt across the Midwest, consolidating farms for large-scale automated operations. He handed her the papers. She read them with hands that shook. Her farm was part of a package deal. 17 properties across Wisconsin, totaling over 10,000 acres. Total purchase price, $47 million. Her debt specifically, purchased for $350,000, called due in full by December 31st. And there at the bottom of the page, in bold letters, Whitmore Technologies. Below that, in smaller print, the signature approving the acquisition. Caleb J. Whitmore, VP of Real Estate and Agricultural Development. The name detonated in her mind like a bomb. Tatiana stood on her porch, staring at that signature, and felt the world tilt. Caleb J. Whitmore. Just Caleb, he'd said. The man dying in her snow had seemed so human, so vulnerable, so grateful for simple kindness. And all along, he'd been Caleb Whitmore, vice president of the company now taking her farm. The memories flooded back with new, poisonous context. She'd told him everything that Christmas Eve, about her father's death, about turning down her scholarship, about the financial struggle, about how the farm was all she had. And he'd sat there, listening, nodding sympathetically, never once mentioning that his family's company was exactly the kind of entity that bought up struggling farms and turned them into corporate operations. Either he'd known all along, had hidden his identity deliberately while gathering information about her vulnerabilities, or he'd found out later and done nothing to stop it. Both options made her sick. That night, Tatiana stood alone in her barn with the foreclosure papers in her hand. Hope, now nearly 3 years old, nickered softly from her stall. Buttercup dozed peacefully. The barn smelled like hay and horses, and the life she'd fought so hard to preserve. All of it ending. All of it being taken by a man whose life she'd saved. "I should have let you die in that snow," she whispered into the darkness. The words tasted like poison. She hated herself immediately for thinking of them, for saying them, for letting. The betrayal twisted her into someone who could wish death on another person. But the pain was real. The anger was justified. She had saved Caleb Whitmore's life, and now he was taking hers. We return now to that December 23rd moment, to Caleb standing in Tatiana, his frozen driveway, to the question hanging between them like smoke. 3 weeks earlier, Caleb had been in his Seattle office reviewing quarterly reports when something caught his eye. A routine acquisition summary from Timothy Caldwell's department. Wisconsin Agricultural Consolidation Project. Final phase. He'd approved it 18 months ago without much thought. Just another land deal among hundreds his company processed annually. But this time, something made him actually read the details. 17 properties. Crawford County, Wisconsin. One of them, Clark Family Farm, 200 acres, generational ownership dating to 1923. Clark. The name hit him like a fist to the chest. He'd pulled up the full file immediately, hands shaking as he scrolled through. Property records, debt acquisition documents, foreclosure timelines. Tatiana Clark, owner. 4 generations of family history. Debt purchased by Whitmore Agricultural Holdings 6 months prior. Final payment due December 30. First. His company was taking her farm. The woman who'd saved his life was losing everything because of a deal he'd signed off on without even reading the names. Caleb had called Timothy Caldwell into his office that same day. The Wisconsin Consolidation Project, Caleb said without preamble. Walk me through it again. Specifically the Clark property. Timothy pulled up the presentation on the conference room screen. Maps, projections, ROI calculations. The Clark property is actually central to the whole operation, Timothy explained, pointing to an aerial view. It sits right in the middle of the assembled parcels. Without it, we have two disconnected sections that significantly reduce the efficiency of the automated farming systems we're planning to implement. The board approved the $47 million investment specifically because we could guarantee all 10,000 acres contiguous. What if we removed it from the package? Timothy looked confused. Sir, that would compromise the entire project. We'd lose at least 30% of projected efficiency. The board would never approve moving forward without that centerpiece. What if I personally purchase the Clark property separately? You want to? I'm sorry, I don't understand. Caleb chose his words carefully. The Clark farm. I want to handle it outside of corporate acquisition. Personal purchase. Keep it out of the project entirely. Timothy's expression shifted from confusion to concern. Mr. Whitmore, is there something about this property I should know? Legal issues? Environmental problems? No, nothing like that. It's personal. Personal how? That's not your concern. Can it be done? Timothy hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Technically, yes. You could purchase the debt from the bank before the corporation completes the acquisition. But the board won't like it. They're expecting the full package. Your father specifically approved this project based on the complete parcel assembly. Let me worry about the board. And my father. Over the next 3 weeks, Caleb worked in absolute secrecy. He contacted First Wisconsin Bank directly, bypassing Whitmore Agricultural Holdings entirely, negotiated to purchase Tatiana's debt personally for $400,000, more than the corporation had paid for it. The bank didn't care who wrote the check as long as it cleared. He had his personal attorney draw up papers transferring full ownership of the property to Tatiana Clark, free of all liens and encumbrances. No strings, no conditions. Just her name on a deed to land she'd already sacrificed everything to keep. He didn't tell Timothy, didn't tell the board, didn't tell Preston, who would have called him a sentimental fool for torpedoing a major project over one woman and one farm. He just did it, because it was the only thing that mattered. And then, on December 23rd, exactly 3 years after she'd pulled him from the snow, he drove to her farm to tell her. Standing in her driveway now, facing her anger and her pitchfork, Caleb tried to find the words he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. Tatiana, I know you don't want to see me. Mr. Whitmore, she corrected, her voice sharp as broken glass. Let's be clear about who you are. Please don't call me that. Why not? It's your name. Caleb Whitmore, billionaire, executive, the man whose company is taking my farm. Should I have called you that from the beginning? Would it have been more honest? I should have told you. Yes, you should have. She lowered the pitchfork slightly but didn't put it down. You sat in my living room on Christmas Eve. I told you everything. About my father, about the farm, about the financial struggle, and you said nothing. I was a coward. You were a liar. You're right. The wind had died down, leaving them in terrible stillness. Snow crunched under Caleb's boots as he took a small step forward. I was afraid, he said. That night at your farm, I felt something I'd never felt before. Purpose, connection, like I actually mattered as a person, not as a name or a bank account. And I was terrified that if you knew who I really was, you'd see me the way everyone else does. As for money, as an opportunity, as something to use. So, instead, you used me. No, I never. She cut him off. You didn't use me. Your company bought my debt 6 months ago. You signed the papers. I saw your signature. Caleb J. Whitmore, VP of Real Estate and Agricultural Development. Did you know it was my farm when you signed? Or did you just not care enough to look at the names? Caleb's face went pale. I didn't know. Not until 3 weeks ago. I swear to you, Tatiana, I signed off on that acquisition 18 months ago as paperwork. Numbers on a page. I never looked at the names, never connected it to you until I saw your property in the quarterly reports. But once I knew, I did everything I could to fix it. 3 weeks ago, she let out a bitter laugh. You've known for 3 weeks that your company was taking my farm, and you're showing up now? 3 days before the deadline. I needed time to arrange everything, to make it right. Make it right. How exactly do you make this right, Caleb? Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a leather folder. He opened it, hands shaking from cold and nerves, and held it out to her. What is this? Tatiana asked, not taking it. Look at it, please. She finally set down the pitchfork and took the folder. Inside were documents, legal papers with official seals and signatures. She read them slowly, her eyes widening with each page. Debt purchase agreement. Caleb J. Whitmore, personal purchaser, $400,000. Paid in full to First Wisconsin Bank. Property deed. Clark Family Farm, 200 acres. Transferred to Tatiana Clark, free and clear of all encumbrances. She looked up, her face a storm of emotions. What is this? It's your farm. I bought your debt from the bank personally, not the company. Me. And I'm transferring the property to you. No mortgage. No strings. It's yours. You're trying to buy forgiveness. I'm trying to make things right. With billionaire money, you think you can just throw cash at a problem and make it disappear? No. I think I destroyed something precious, and this is the only way I know to begin fixing it. Tatiana stared at the papers like they might burst into flames. Why? Why does this matter to you so much? Caleb's voice cracked. Because I haven't stopped thinking about you. Not for 1 day in 3 years. I hired an investigator to try to find you, but I didn't have enough information. Just your first name and Crawford County. He searched for months and kept hitting dead ends. I'd check his reports obsessively, hoping for any lead, any trace of you. That's not love. That's an obsession, maybe. Or maybe it's what love looks like when you've never felt it before and don't know how to handle it. He took a breath. The life you live here, the purpose, the work that matters, the connection to something bigger than yourself, it woke me up. You woke me up. And I've been sleepwalking ever since I left. Tears formed in Tatiana's eyes, though she fought them. Don't do this. I love you, Tatiana. I don't know when it happened exactly. Maybe it was when you called me an idiot for driving in the storm. Maybe it was when you sang those hymns to keep yourself awake while I was dying on your couch. Maybe it was when you told me that everyone's a person, and some people just forget it. But it's real, and it's not going away. I don't know how to love anymore, Tatiana whispered. The words came out broken, raw. The farm took that from me. I gave everything to this land, my education, my youth, my entire life. I don't have anything left to give you. Caleb stepped closer. Then let me love you enough for both of us until you remember how. She shook her head. That's not how it works. Love isn't something you can just decide to feel. And even if I could, even if there's some part of me that wants to believe this is real, I can. To just accept your land and your money and your declarations like we're in some fairy tale. What do you want from me? I want you to prove it. Tatiana straightened her shoulders, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. If you truly want to make things right, if you actually want to be in my life, then stay. Work this farm with me for 1 full season. Spring planting through fall harvest. 7 months of real work, not a weekend visit or a charity project. 7 months of 4 a.m. mornings and broken equipment and weather that doesn't care about your schedule. Tatiana, I'm not done. You'll live here, in the farmhouse, not commuting from some hotel in town. You'll eat what I eat, work when I work, sleep when I sleep. You'll learn what this life actually costs. And at the end of harvest, if you're still here, If you still think you love me and this life, then we'll talk about what comes next. Caleb stared at her. You're serious? Completely. Those are my terms. Take them or leave. What about my job? The company? That's your problem to solve. You're a billionaire. Figure it out. And if I do this, if I stay the whole season, you'll give us a chance. I'll consider it. That's all I'm promising. Caleb looked at the farmhouse, the barn, the snow-covered fields stretching into darkness. This was insane. He had $1 billion company to run, board meetings, investors, responsibilities that affected thousands of employees. But when has any of that ever made him feel the way Tatiana did? When has pushing money around spreadsheets ever compared to splitting wood and feeling his muscles burn with actual purpose? Okay, he said, I'll do it. Just like that. Just like that. Tell me where to start. Tatiana studied him for a long moment, looking for cracks in his resolve. Then she walked to the barn and came back with a pitchfork, pressing it into his hands. The stalls need mucking. Buttercup and Hope have been in all day because of the cold. It's messy, it smells, and it's not optional. If you're serious about this, you start now. Caleb took the pitchfork, the wood handle rough against his palms that had gone soft again over 3 years. He looked at this woman who'd saved his life and was now offering to save it again in a completely different way. I'm serious. Then get to work, Mr. Whitmore. And for God's sake, take off that ridiculous coat. You'll ruin it. He followed her toward the barn, realizing something fundamental. This was going to be the hardest fight of his life. Not in a boardroom, not with quarterly reports and investor presentations, but here, in the dirt and the cold and the relentless daily grind of keeping something alive against impossible odds. And for the first time in his entire privileged existence, Caleb Whitmore was ready to fight for something that actually mattered. The alarm went off at 4 a.m. on Caleb's first full day, and he discovered that agreeing to something and actually doing it were vastly different experiences. His body screamed. Every muscle from the previous night's barn work protested movement. His hands, blistered from the pitchfork, throbbed when he tried to make a fist. His back felt like someone had taken a hammer to his spine. Tatiana was already dressed, pulling on boots in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the counter. Morning, she said without looking at him. Cows need milking. I'll show you once, then you're doing it yourself tomorrow. Spring was brutal in ways Caleb had never conceived. Planting season meant 18-hour days preparing fields, checking equipment, hauling seed, operating machinery he'd never touched before. He failed constantly, drove the tractor into a fence post his second week, spilled an entire bag of expensive seed because he didn't secure it properly, mixed up the feed proportions and made half the chickens sick. Tatiana corrected him with patience that surprised them both. Sometimes her instruction was sharp. No, not like that. You'll break it. But other times she did stand behind him, guiding his hands, showing him the rhythm of work he needed to learn. Why are you doing this? He asked one morning, exhausted and covered in mud from fixing an irrigation line. You could do all of this faster without me slowing you down. Probably. But you made a commitment. And I want to see if you keep it when it stops being romantic and starts being just hard. He kept it. Got up every morning at 4 a.m. I learned to milk cows with hands that slowly built calluses. I learned to read the sky for weather changes. Learned that the land didn't care about his last name or his bank account, only about whether he showed up and did the work. He'd called Preston 2 days after arriving, told him he was taking a leave of absence. The conversation had been predictably explosive. A leave of absence. For what? Preston had demanded. Personal reasons. Personal reasons don't pay shareholders, Caleb. Get back here. No. The single word had hung in the air like a gunshot. Caleb had never said no to his father before. Not once in 35 years. I'm taking 7 months, Caleb had continued. Timothy can handle the division. Jennifer knows where everything is. I'll be available for emergencies. But I'm not coming back until October. Preston had threatened, cajoled, questioned his sanity. But Caleb had held firm. And for the first time in his life, his father's approval didn't matter more than his own choice. By summer, Caleb had developed what Tatiana called farm muscle, the kind that came from repetitive, practical labor rather than calculated gym routines. They survived a hailstorm in June that destroyed a quarter of the wheat crop. Caleb stood in the field afterward, looking at the flattened grain, and felt the loss like a physical wound. These weren't abstract numbers on a quarterly report. This was months of work destroyed in 20 minutes. What do we do? He asked. We salvage what we can. File an insurance claim, plant a late crop in the damaged sections, and we keep going. She looked at him. This is the part nobody tells you about farming. Nature doesn't negotiate. You just adapt or survive. They fixed the ancient harvester together when it broke down in July, spending 12 hours in 95-degree heat replacing parts and arguing about which wrench to use. By the end, they were both filthy and sunburned, but the machine ran. The evenings became their time to talk. After dinner, simple meals Tatiana cooked from her garden and their chickens. They did sit on the porch and watch the sun set over fields they'd worked together. Tatiana told him more about her mother Eleanor, about Christmas Eves filled with hymns and homemade cookies, about how cancer had stolen that warmth so quickly. She told him about Graham's quiet strength, about how he'd never said I love you but showed it in every lesson, every moment of patience teaching her to survive without him. Caleb shared about Preston, about chasing approval from a man who saw affection as weakness and success as the baseline expectation. He told her about Evelyn's pill bottles and charity galas, about how his mother had constructed an entire life to avoid feeling anything real. He told her about Iris, about how his sister's rebellion was just another way of screaming for attention their parents would never give. I spent my whole life trying to be what Preston wanted, Caleb said one night, fireflies dancing in the fields beyond the porch. And I became exactly that, hollow, successful, and completely empty. And now I wake up sore and exhausted, and I've never been happier. Is that crazy? No, it's just real. By late summer, something had shifted between them. Tatiana found herself looking forward to Caleb's questions, even the ridiculous ones. Why do we plant corn in rows but wheat in fields? How do chickens know when to lay eggs? His genuine curiosity about a life she'd always known made her see it differently. She noticed small changes in him, the way his shoulders had broadened from real work, the confidence in his movements as he handled tools he'd been terrified of in spring, the way he'd wake up before the alarm sometimes, ready to start the day instead of dreading it. He noticed her walls coming down incrementally. She laughed more, smiled when she thought he wasn't looking, let him help, without immediately taking over when he struggled. One morning, she'd corrected his milking technique by putting her hands over his, and instead of pulling away quickly, she'd left them there for just a moment longer than necessary. They shared meals at the end of exhausting days, comparing notes about what needed fixing, what crops looked good, what animals needed attention. It felt like a partnership, like building something together instead of her carrying everything alone. One evening in August, after bringing in the first wheat harvest, they celebrated with beer from town and steaks Caleb had bought as a treat. We did it, she said, her voice tired but satisfied. Full harvest. Farms stable. We did it, Caleb echoed. Together. She looked at him across the porch. This man who'd shown up in winter and stayed through summer, who had blistered his hands and burned his skin and never once complained about the life he'd left behind. I was wrong about you, she said quietly. How so? I thought you'd quit. Thought you'd last maybe a month before you realized how hard this is and went running back to your penthouse and your easy life. This isn't easy. But it's real, and I'll take real and hard over easy and empty every single time. It happened on a Thursday evening in late September, 3 weeks before harvest ended. They sat on the porch watching the sun paint the sky orange and gold over fields they'd worked together for 7 months. Caleb was reading through maintenance notes for the equipment, and Tatiana was shelling peas from her garden. Without planning it, without thinking about it, she reached over and took his hand. He looked at her, surprised. "I remember," she said. "Remember what?" "How to love. I thought the farm had taken that from me, that I'd given up so much for so long that there was nothing left. But it's still there, and it scares the hell out of me." Caleb set down the notebook and turned to face her fully. "Why does it scare you?" "Because loving someone means risking losing them. My mother died. My father died. Everyone I've ever loved has left, one way or another. And you have a whole other life waiting for you. What happens when this novelty wears off and you realize you miss your real world? This is my real world now. That other life was the performance. This is real. You are real. And yes, fear means it's real. But I'm willing to walk through that fear with you if you'll let me." Tatiana's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. But we'll figure it out. Together. Like we figured out everything else this season." She squeezed his hand tighter. "Okay. Okay? Okay. Let's try." Caleb pulled her close, and Tatiana let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember. October brought harvest season, and they worked side by side bringing in corn and the second wheat planting. The work was relentless, racing against weather and time, but they moved as a unit now. Caleb anticipated what Tatiana needed before she asked. She trusted him with tasks she would never have delegated 8 months ago. The farm was stable, more than stable, thriving. Caleb had restructured the finances through his personal accounts, eliminating the predatory debt while ensuring the farm had operating capital. Tatiana had brought in the best yields in 5 years through sheer determination and Caleb's willingness to invest in better equipment. On the last day of harvest, they stood in the barn looking at the stored grain, the healthy livestock, and the repaired buildings. "We did it," Tatiana said, exhausted and proud. "Full season. Farm saved. You survived." "We survived," Caleb corrected. "And I don't want to stop." "Stop what?" "This. Us. Building this life together. I know your condition was 1 season, and we've done that. But I want more. I want every season for the rest of our lives." Tatiana turned to face him, her expression serious. "Are you asking what I think you're asking? Marry me. Not because I saved your farm or because we survived 7 months of hard work, but because I love you. Because you make me want to be better. Because I wake up excited about the day instead of dreading it. Because I'd rather muck stalls with you than attend 1,000 board meetings without you." Tatiana Clark looked at this man who'd been a stranger, then a betrayal, then a partner, and now something more. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes." They married on Christmas Eve, exactly 3 years after the storm that changed everything. The ceremony took place in the barn where Tatiana had delivered hope, where she'd told Caleb stories through the night to keep herself awake while he fought hypothermia. Pastor Daniel Brooks from the small church in town officiated, his kind face beaming as he stood before them. Iris Whitmore attended, flying in from Seattle. She'd been working with a therapist and finding purpose, volunteering with troubled youth. She cried openly watching her brother marry someone real, someone who loved him for who he was, rather than what he represented. Renee Matthews stood beside Tatiana, her husband David and their 2 children filling the front row. The neighbors came, the Hendersons, Mary Lou from the truck stop, Dr. Susan Pennington, the vet, even Martin Doyle from the bank who'd come to genuinely respect what Tatiana had built. The barn was decorated simply. White lights strung from the rafters, wildflowers in mason jars, hay bales for seating. It was nothing like the elaborate Seattle society wedding Preston had probably envisioned for his son, but it was perfect. Hope, now a beautiful 3-year-old mare, stood in her stall watching the proceedings. When Pastor Brooks asked if anyone objected to the union, Hope whinnied, loudly breaking the solemn moment and making everyone laugh. "I think that's approval, not objection," the pastor said with a grin. Caleb went first, his voice steady despite the emotion. "Tatiana, 3 years ago, you saved my life when you had every reason to leave me in the snow. A year ago, You saved it again by giving me a purpose worth living for. I promise to keep earning the second chance you gave me every single day. I promise never to hide from you, never to let money or status or fear come between us. I promise to wake at 4 a.m. and muck the stalls and fix what breaks and share the burden you used to carry alone. I promise to love you not despite your strength, but because of it. Tatiana's turn came, her voice breaking slightly. Caleb, you came into my life when I'd forgotten what it meant to hope for anything beyond survival. You showed me that letting someone in doesn't make me weak, it makes me human. I promise to let love share the weight I used to carry alone. I promise to trust you with my fears and my dreams and this farm that means everything to me. I promise to remind you that you're more than a name or a fortune. You're a man who chose meaning over comfort. I promise to love you through every season, the easy and the impossible. They exchanged simple gold bands, no diamonds, no extravagance, just solid metal that would last. When Pastor Brooks pronounced them husband and wife, the barn erupted in applause. Caleb kissed his bride surrounded by the life they'd built together. And for the first time in his existence, everything made sense. 3 years after the wedding, the farm bore a new sign at the entrance, Clark Whitmore Farm, Est, 1923, renewed 2024. The operation thrived through a careful blend of traditional wisdom and modern efficiency. Caleb had invested in sustainable technology, solar panels for power, precision agriculture systems that reduced waste, water conservation methods that honored the land Graham had taught Tatiana to protect. But they kept the core work manual, morning chores, evening rounds, hands-on attention to animals that couldn't be replaced by automation. It was still hard, still relentless, but they did it together. Caleb had resigned from his executive position at Whitmore Technologies, taking a board seat that required minimal travel and let him focus on what mattered. He'd started the Clark Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping family farms avoid being swallowed by corporate consolidation. They'd saved 17 operations in 3 years, providing debt relief and business restructuring that let farmers keep their legacy. Preston had been furious initially, then grudgingly impressed when the foundation's work generated positive press for Whitmore Technologies. At least you're doing something useful, he'd admitted. Tatiana ran the farm with confidence bolstered by partnership. She'd hired 2 part-time workers, finally able to afford help without shame. She taught sustainable farming workshops at the county extension office, sharing what 4 generations of Clarks had learned. And on a sunny afternoon in May, their daughter Hope Clark Whitmore took her first steps. In the farmhouse kitchen where Tatiana had warmed her dying husband 6 years before. They'd named her after the foal born during the storm, after the quality Tatiana had, lost and found again, after the reason to believe tomorrow could be better than today. Real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in meaning, in work that matters, in relationships built on truth instead of transaction. Caleb had billions, but he'd been poverty-stricken in the only ways that counted until Tatiana showed him what richness actually felt like. Sacrifice is more bearable when it's shared. Tatiana had carried the farm alone for years, and it had nearly destroyed her. But with Caleb beside her, the same weight became manageable. Not because he made it lighter, but because sharing the burden transforms it from crushing isolation into purposeful partnership. Love after pain takes courage. Both of them had been broken in different ways, Tatiana by loss and exhaustion, Caleb by emptiness and meaninglessness. Choosing to love despite that damage, choosing to risk being hurt, again, required more bravery than either had known they possessed. Identity is created by choices, not just inheritance. Caleb had been born a Whitmore, but he became himself by choosing to wake at 4 a.m. and muck stalls and build something real. Tatiana had been born a Clark, but she became fully herself by choosing to let someone share her burden instead of carrying it alone out of stubborn pride. Second chances must be earned through action, not purchased. Caleb couldn't buy forgiveness with the farm deed. He had to earn it through 7 months of showing up, failing, trying again. and proving through consistent action that his commitment was real. Some storms break you. Others deliver exactly who you need. The blizzard that nearly killed Caleb brought him to Tatiana's door. The metaphorical storm of losing the farm brought him back. What seemed like destruction was actually delivery, bringing two broken people together so they could heal each other. So let me ask you this. What storm in your life brought unexpected blessings? What moment that felt like the end was actually a beginning you didn't see coming? Drop a comment and share your story. I read every single one, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. If this story moved you, if you felt something watching Tatiana and Caleb fight for a love that wasn't easy but was real, hit that like button. It helps this channel reach more people who need to remember that second chances exist and that real wealth has nothing to do with money. Share this video with someone who's in their own storm right now, someone who feels like they're losing everything, someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the worst moments deliver the best possibilities. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Mr. Steele Rich Stories. This channel exists to tell you stories with real lessons, real heart, and real truth about what matters in life. We're building a community of people who believe that character counts more than cash. That purpose beats profit, and that love, real love, is always worth fighting for. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, your storm might be the thing that delivers exactly who you need. Until the next story, keep fighting for what's real.